Planning a wedding and feeling overwhelmed? Simply Eloped makes it easy. With over 14,000 elopements and vow renewals planned and 37 stunning U.S. destinations, the planners at Simply Eloped have you covered. Their all-inclusive packages connect you with over 700 top-tier vendors, cutting stress, cost, and complexity. And no two packages are alike because they customize it for you. Your story deserves ease. Let them handle the hard stuff. You just show up and say, I do. Start at simplyeloped.com.
Today on CityCast DC, our city is in the middle of at least two youth crises. One involves school truancy. The other involves high-profile teen mayhem, like the skirmish on Halloween night between youths and law enforcement at Navy Yard. So are these two crises related? Washington Post reporters Lauren Lumpkin and Robert Samuels were the authors of a blockbuster report on the city's failures to combat truancy. They're here to walk us through some shocking details. Today is Tuesday, November 18th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Lauren, Robert, thank you guys for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So you guys both did this great piece over the summer about DCPS's failure to curb truancy in schools and how that was tied up with this surge in youth crime. A lot obviously has happened since then. This idea of like gangs of wild youth running around the city was front and center when Donald Trump painted this kind of dystopian portrait of a crime-ridden DC. We also know the mayor of DC, Muriel Bowser, has been pushing youth curfews off and on for months. So can we just back up, though? How did truancy get so bad, and how does that badness tie up with the youth crime situation?
Well, I think, truancy has been an issue that DC has dealt with for a long time. Through our reporting, we found, conversations from a decade ago where council members were having very similar conversations as they're having now about saying, okay, we need to tamp down on truancy. And if we make sure kids are in school consistently, then that'll reduce crime in the city. So this has been something that, lawmakers have been working on for a long time and, have made several promises about. I think they identified if kids have really interesting and fun things to do after school, then that'll improve attendance. If they have mental health care in school, that'll improve attendance. There's this whole kind of setup with the city's child welfare agency where, they're supposed to be flagged if a child is missing out of school. But all three of those things have just not really panned out the way that lawmakers and school leaders said that they were supposed to. And I think things like that are driving youth crime. Obviously, we are seeing these huge groups of teenagers in these huge gatherings. I think those issues are similar, but, to kind of look at one thing or one single thing as a cause of crime, I think is a little bit unfair because there's just so many different things that kind of are feeding into this crisis with kids.
This is one of these issues that has been talked about a lot post-COVID. And obviously, fear of juvenile delinquents, as they used to call them, and kids playing hooky, that goes back decades or centuries even. But post-COVID, there's a sense that this has become a bigger problem. And some of the stats you guys cited in your reporting bear this out. And I'm curious if there's a sense that sort of like with turnstile jumping in the metro, that the COVID era created a different permission structure, that once people saw you could do it, it just became a thing people did more often than before.
Yeah, I think there's this narrative that once COVID happened, the kids went wild and they've been hard to contain since. Mm-hmm. But actually what I think a lot of the reporting showed was the seeds and the roots of this crisis as it was happening in the post-COVID era started before COVID hit. And that's why looking at truancy was such an important thing for us to do, Michael, because what we saw was that particularly in the middle schools, right, the age group where we're really concerned about them hijacking and doing these turnstile jumps and all sorts of things, those truancy rates had been rising significantly before the pandemic, right? The pandemic accelerated it. But those things were happening before. And I think it's important to note why they might have been happening before. What the reporting showed was if you go back about a decade and you look at the promises that the district government made to help keep kids in school, they didn't really fulfill those promises, right? So I think, yes, it is true. The socioeconomic conditions that started bearing itself to be during COVID really enhanced it. But it's also true that if you look at how the district promised parents that they would handle truancy in the child welfare system, they didn't do that.
Right.
If you think about the amount of school programs, they didn't do that either. So there is a lot of things that went into it.
So let's talk about both the sense of crisis, because it's a term some people react strongly to, but you guys had some pretty jaw-dropping data in your reporting about the extent of truancy and how much it has changed, not just post-COVID, but over the last decade or two. Can you explain some of that to folks?
I think the first thing is to, we look at truancy, and one of the things that we noticed was when you look at truancy numbers in general, you saw over the past decade, the number of middle schools who are truant go up 5 times, multiplied by 5 times, coinciding with the rise in youth crimes, particularly with hijacking. And then when you start looking at the number of reports, so to back up, there's a system that's supposed to happen when a student misses school, particularly in the middle school years. If a student misses 10 days of school, someone in the school is supposed to call the child welfare system, what we know as here at the Child and Family Services Agency, or CFSA. CFSA is supposed to prompt an investigation to see whether or not there's something wrong at home, or to connect the student with services. And oftentimes what our reporting found was in more than 90% of the time, the Child Welfare Services Agency chose not to investigate. Now, if you talk to people who work in that agency, they will tell you that most of these issues are largely bureaucratic, or they should be handled by someone else because they're not putting the child necessarily in danger. But what our reporting found is that practically every child who appears in front of a judge in DC has a record with truancy. And what people who worked on the review board found us on some of the child fatality review boards told us was that oftentimes when they see a child who has died because of a homicide or an abuse, there had been several calls made to the agency that these kids had been missing school and no one had followed up on them.
But let me back up. You called the Child Services Agency, which under the city's rules, whether those are good rules or not, those under the city's sort of process, is supposed to take action or gets a report if a kid has missed more than 10 days of school. And they said, basically, that should be someone else's job?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, we saw over the last 3 school years, it was more than 18,000 of these reports that were not investigated. And basically, the agency will get them if they determine that there is, real abuse and neglect going on. Then those are the cases that they prioritize. Anything else just doesn't really get investigated. And kind of what that means is that for 18,000 of these reports, we don't know what's going on with these kids at home. We don't know why they're missing school. And that's usually kind of where it stops. The school, can do a lot of work in reaching out to families and trying to get to the root of the issue, but schools can only do so much. It's really, the Child and Family Services Agency, it's their job. But they, like I said, all of these reports, thousands of reports that they don't rise to the level of abuse. And so nothing really happens to them.
That seems outrageous. Like, did the bosses of the Child and Family Services Agency, which is to say the mayor of the city or the council that's supposed to oversee the government, How did they react to this data?
Well, now actually, Zach Parker, council member for Ward 5, is actually, he put forward a piece of legislation last month that is designed to kind of get to the root of this issue, where all of those, those 18,000 reports that I mentioned, they would go to a different agency, the Department of Human Services. And so that would just task this other agency of looking into those cases and, figuring out why those kids are missing school. There's some debate over whether that agency is best suited to do it, whether they can handle that amount of work. But it is a solution that has at least come out since our story published, a potential solution.
So you guys spoke with a lot of teachers, a lot of students about this, and I know that we've got this correlation between truancy and youth crime, and for that matter, youth being victims of homicide. Whether that means causality or not, I'm not sure. But what did other teachers and students tell you about why people are missing school and why that number may have changed?
Well, a lot of the reporting showed that most kids who miss school do not go out and commit crimes.
Sure.
They're trying to help out with their families. They might have a sick parent. They might need to take on additional work, right? They might just be overwhelmed by the conditions of living in a fast gentrifying city. They might be dealing with mental health issues that they're not being diagnosed, right? So there's a lot of reasons why students are not going to school, right? At the very base, the word that I kept hearing from teachers and students was school is boring, right? There's nothing for us to do when we get there. There's no incentive for us to go. And I think when you hear something like that, you have to begin thinking about what's being offered in these schools, whether students feel like they have the chances or opportunities to generate a future, and whether their parents believe the same thing. One of the things that I found really interesting during the reporting was that when we spoke with Kaya Henderson, who was a former schools chancellor, there was a crime wave and she had to go out and try to figure out what needed to be done. Kids told her school was boring. She came up with a plan that every school should have at least 30 after-school programs. This wasn't codified into the law. This was a goal that she had. And she got some money from the DC government and foundations to do it. Those plans left with Chancellor Henderson, but what our analysis showed was that most places never got to the 30 programs, right? I think the median was about 23 programs per school. But when we looked at it, the schools that had programs above the median, their truancy rates were half the number of schools below the median, right? In other words, if your school had a below average number of after school programs, your kids were twice as likely to miss school than schools that had more after school programs.
Right.
And I think that's really telling about the way schools are being handled in the district. The other thing was, during the course of reporting, the current chancellor had made these proclamations, and the district has made these proclamations to have after school for all, right? But then when we looked at the reporting, we saw that they decreased the budget by $1 million, saying that they didn't have the federal money. And the goals that they set for themselves to increase the number of programs in middle schools, they just didn't do them. They were just at the very beginning stages. So there's a lot of accountability that we had on many structures.
I think life for kids, like life outside of school can be boring too. Lots of kids will, there's nothing to do. There's like kind of like the rec centers, but, some kids are not happy with the programming there.
Yeah.
I think like that boredom extends to life outside of school.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why we're seeing these big gatherings. It's like, what are you going to do if you're 16 years old?
Yeah.
Everything is expensive and there's nothing like fun and free to do than like hang out on U Street. So maybe that would be a good thing to mention.
This holiday season, DC small business needs our support more than ever. That's why we're excited to tell you about the DC Holiday Hunt, a citywide scavenger hunt that makes supporting local shops and restaurants fun and rewarding. It's simple. Earn points by visiting small businesses, exploring neighborhood landmarks, answering trivia questions, and sharing your favorite holiday traditions. With over $3,000 in prizes from local DC businesses up for grabs, there has never been a better reason to explore our city. The hunt runs from November 23rd through January 3rd. Visit districtbridges.org/DC Holiday Hunt to sign up today. That's districtbridges.org/DC Holiday Hunt.
Guess what? CityCast has some news. I'm Sean McPherson, the host of CityCast Twin Cities.
And I'm Jane Sihu, and I'm the host of CityCast Seattle. Hey, if you have a friend in one of our cities, can you text them for us?
Yeah, something, simple like, hey, how's that rash doing? And do you listen to podcasts? Because I have one you're definitely going to like. After that, tell them that CityCast has helped you become more informed, more involved, and more connected to your amazing city.
We're going to help that person you know in Seattle who's been trying to make friends.
And we're also going to do that for that guy you only kind of knew in college who moved back to the Twin Cities after graduation.
Don't we all have that guy?
Yeah, and usually that guy is named Todd.
So did you text him yet?
Jane, let's just wait a minute. We don't want to rush anybody. We'll do a little small talk. How's everything going in Seattle?
Beautiful, beautiful. Fall leaves popping. How about Twin Cities?
Today, beautiful and sunshiny in St. Paul. Okay, Jane, I bet they are done texting by now, and I just want to remind them, hey, you, please tell that friend to subscribe to CityCast Twin Cities or Seattle, wherever you get your podcasts.
Or if you don't want to text them and you're really just on Instagram sending them DMs all the time with like funny videos, send them a DM of our latest videos. You can find us at CityCast Twin Cities or CityCast Seattle on Instagram. Thanks.
Obviously, like, I don't want to simplify something that's multi-determined, but if kids are saying, there's nothing to do at school, it's boring, DCPS is supposed to, has a sort of standard curriculum across the city, but truancy was not standard across the city. It correlated pretty highly with poverty. It's a knotty set of issues, but you had just said that these are kids dealing with the reality of living in a gentrifying city or with incredibly difficult circumstances. Is there any data that suggests that even if you control for that, after-school programs help, or after-school programs another function of that, in that people in a richer neighborhood can afford more after-school programs?
I think, even the city itself has done a lot of research into that specific question. And I think it's fair to say that it's been established, whether it's in DC or, looking at school districts across the country, that there is a positive relationship between, not just like after school programs, but quality after school programs, something where kids are going and they feel like they're getting something out of it. It's enriching, not just something where maybe they're sitting around for an hour after school.
Yeah.
The mayor has acknowledged this. The chancellor has acknowledged this. The deputy mayor of education has acknowledged this. And, even still, we see just so many gaps. Schools where, there's schools where, maybe they have some extra funding and they can, they can have more programs, or, they have parents who have time to volunteer to lead some of these programs after school. So I think, there's definitely, a lot of research that I think suggests that, there are, of course, things that schools cannot control, but that plays a huge role, and city officials have acknowledged that.
So listen, I know as a longtime DCPS parent, your kid is absent, you get an email by the end of the day, did you know that little Susie didn't go to school today, blah, blah, blah. And that invites you to say like, oh, crap, I forgot to tell the school about the dentist appointment or whatever. Tell me about the process after that for truancy. Like what is supposed to happen? What is the enforcement mechanism here?
So, right, after that email, that message goes out to the parent, you do have, I think, an opportunity to explain why the absence happened. I also know DCPS this year, maybe you've noticed this, there's some type of virtual system that allows parents to let the school know about absences, which I think that is something that is supposed to make it easier for parents to report absences. So maybe, we'll see at least more absences with excuses. But right, after you get that message, basically you have 5 opportunities, 5 times to be absent. And then that triggers this thing called a student support team meeting, or a student support team conference, where the family and the school they're supposed to get together and discuss what's going on. How can the school help? Why is this child missing school? If the absences continue, depending on the age of the child, if they are between like 5 and 13 years old, if they have 10 unexcused absences, then that triggers that notification to Child and Family Services Agency. If they're an older child and they continue to miss school, then they are referred to the court system. I think either of those,
They being the child or the parents?
the child, and yeah, exactly, the child is referred to the court system. The Attorney General has taken the position not to prosecute, but they're supposed to hook the family up with services, counseling and therapy and things like that.
Why doesn't the Attorney General want to prosecute?
Because there has been some research, some data that suggests that like those harsher consequences may not solve the issue. You know, for example, like if a family's already having trouble getting to school, and you know that parent is fined, or maybe that makes it even more challenging to get to school. You know, like there's some schools of thought to say like that doesn't actually get to the root of the problem. It just kind of makes the problem worse. And so I think that's why in DC the Attorney General has taken that position. But then, you know, you kind of wonder, well, then what happens? I don't know, like what's, you know, whether we should have harsher consequences. Some people do think that's the case. Some people think we need to just pour more money into social programs and things that are going to get to the root of the attendance issues. But I think no matter what path you go on, whether you're an older child and going to the court system or you're a younger child and going to the Child and Family Services Agency, that's kind of where things stop. And students are, you know, kind of able to miss much more school after that without any serious consequences.
I'm curious about the politics there. That look, the Attorney General of DC is elected, and elected officials tend to respond to incentives of what's going to get them unelected. So is there a thinking there that actually bringing the hammer down on kids or their parents is going to be like broadly unpopular with the public in DC?
I think that's a really good question. Well, it's a good question to maybe guide some of our reporting in the future. Like I said, I've just being steeped in this issue. I've heard things from both sides. I think a lot of that is coming up with all the youth curfew conversations of kids need consequences and families need consequences. And there is a belief that you can, you know, go and have one of these, you know, quote unquote takeovers in Navy Yard and nothing will happen to you. Or you can, you know, keep your kid home from school for several days and nothing will happen to you.
Right.
Like I said, I don't know kind of what people in DC are feeling. But I have heard things on both sides, whether we need more harsher consequences or, you know, bulking up social programs more to get to the root causes of things.
I think also the tides for that question have changed over the years. I mean, you had folks like David Catania and other people who gathered a lot of momentum in sort of this idea that you need to hold parents accountable for the actions of their kids, who, you know, were able to get reelected and, you know, do kind of well. You know, David Catania didn't become mayor, but he tried. And I think there's also the reality of it as well, that when you think about a lot of the social determinants of what happens if you start having harsher punishment for youth and for the parents, right? It clogs up your court system. It does a lot of things that, you know, might not just be politically unpopular, but they do make your job considerably harder. And there's no actual evidence that it would work. So I think that's a big part of it too.
So the legislation that is facing the council right now, this bill that would reroute the reports through the human services instead of child services, is there a sense that this would make a major difference? And if so, why?
I think the goal is that, right, it would make a big difference because all of those cases that I mentioned earlier that don't get investigated, theoretically, this other agency would investigate them. And the Department of Human Services, they already house a lot of programs for families and young people that are having trouble. You know, they do a lot of family counseling and, you know, helping families get access to stable housing and food and things like that. So it does make sense to look at the Department of Human Services. But I think there is a question of, like, can they handle it?
Right.
This came up in a hearing with the agency's acting director, Rachel Pierre, and there were some questions over, you know, this Zach Parker was there, and there were some questions over kind of like his proposal. And basically she was like, she's open, but like the resources need to be there. And the way I interpreted that was that we need money and people.
Right.
And this came up last year when the Department of Human Services was asked to take on this truancy pilot, where they would go and basically work with some of the district's most truant high schoolers and do some more kind of intensive case management programming with those students and their families. It's been successful, but it takes money and it takes time and it takes people. Right. And there was some debate then about whether the Department of Human Services could take that on. They did end up getting some more money, and the program was expanded this year. But is there going to be appetite to give them even more money to take on these truancy cases? I think that's something we'll have to see, when budget conversations get started up again.
And I think that the causality remains this sort of question at the center of this, that, what changed in the last 10 years? Did the reporting system change, and that's the reason why this number has gone up, or was it something else? And so the idea of, can you control for the thing that changed? But I think what I hear you guys saying is that there's so many factors here that we can't really agree on what the thing is that changed.
No, I don't think that's entirely correct. I think what we know is that the district set up systems and then did not give them the chance to work.
Yeah.
And when they set up a reporting system, and when our reporting shows people on the service side complained that the reporting system was overwhelming and that it needed to be fixed, the DC council didn't take it up. The mayor was not involved in the intervention. So, and we see that a lot. That is the thing that was most consistent, that a law is presented, it's backed up by some research that will show it will work, and it's not carried through. Sometimes it's not carried through because of changes in leadership. Sometimes it's not carried through because there is fading interest in it. We spoke with a lot of people who do social services in the district, who sponsor clubs and things like that. And the thing they told us repeatedly was, we've been talking about this for years, but no one really cared until we saw the crime numbers go up, right? And our fear is that if these crime numbers go down, or it stops becoming a headline, the DC government will continue to ignore it again. So I don't think the reporting sort of had left a suggestion in my mind that there's some hidden thing that's missing. The thing that's missing is actual enforcement of the law and implementation of policy.
And this also takes place now against the backdrop of the last 3 months with the Trump administration's takeover of the MPD, the president's characterizations of DC that I think really bother a lot of people, and even the sort of tendency to paint out of control kids. It evokes a lot of racist tropes, among other things. And I can imagine that those tropes either spur a backlash of no, this isn't a problem, or spur action where otherwise attention might fade as crime rates go down. Do you have a sense of what is the interplay between the politics of the moment, the Trump administration in Washington, and action on this issue?
I think there's definitely a lot of pressure on DC right now to get the crime under control. And, we do know that crime has fallen over the last year. I think some of the, obviously crime it's a problem in DC. I don't think anyone would argue that, but, the crime rates have gone down. But there still is pressure, right? As kind of the president is watching the city, as the country is watching the city to get it under control. And I think that's, maybe why there's an appetite for a youth curfew. The proposal that Zach Parker has put forward, has a chance because, like I said, there is some real pressure to get the problem under control. And the city leaders definitely want to make it seem like they have the problem under control and they're not scrambling.
And yet, if I read the reporting right, truancy rates are still up and maybe climbing?
Yeah, DCPS did see an uptick last year, and I think it's because of, some of the issues that we pointed out in our reporting. I do know the chancellor said that he's added some more after-school programs in middle school this current school year, and that is something that we talked about in depth in the story. Like I mentioned, there is the school district is using this new kind of software to make it easier for families to report absences. So you do see kind of things that are happening, some acknowledgement of the issue, and some maybe some policy changes that are happening. But right at the same time, we did see an uptick last year, which I know a lot of people are really concerned about.
On the face of it, some of the stories about youth crime and the youth curfew would seem to have not that much to do with truancy. I mean, we're literally talking about incidents that happen late at night, not during school hours, etc. So there's a complex interplay here. But do you have a sense of whether this sort of deployments and curfews and so on of the last few months will actually affect youth crime one way or the other?
Yeah, so over the summer, we did see that some of these huge gatherings did decrease when the curfew was in effect. When the curfew expired, we saw them kind of come back up again, and then now the curfew has been extended, and there is, I think, a hope that they'll come back down. I think, right. I mean, kids know what's going on. And so they know when, there's a curfew in place and where there's going to be law enforcement. Obviously, they know that there are federal, agents in the city. And I think kids are, they're smart and they know what's going on and they see that and say, okay, we're going to pull back. I've talked to kids who said, Friday night, I'm going to stay in because, I don't even want to be in the vicinity of any of that.
Right.
But I think kind of long term, right? Does it decrease violence? Does it decrease crime? The research actually is very mixed, looking at not just DC, but youth curfews across the country. It's not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. The research is very mixed on it. But I think, just the way that you've seen there's a curfew, maybe they come back. There's no curfew, these gatherings come up again. And so it's kind of like a whack-a-mole type thing where, okay, this issues thing, we're going to have a curfew. Eventually the curfew will be lifted and then we're going to go back to where things were. That, kind of suggests to me that the root problem, the root cause, whatever it is, isn't actually being addressed.
It's like I keep coming back to, I grew up in DC. I did a lot of dumb stuff as a teenager and my friends did even dumber stuff. But we never jumped the turnstile in the metro. And it wasn't because we were like moral or righteous or law abiding. It was because it seemed like it was as if it was a mile high, like it was just not a thing you did. And then, I assume one day someone did it and got away with it. And people were like, oh, I can do that too. Some of the dynamic with truancy, I think, has to be similar in the sense of like, oh, I can do this. I never thought about doing it before, but now I see I can and I may. And the question, as you guys have studied so many places with policies around this, is there a way that has been successful anywhere to kind of get the genie back in the bottle, to bring numbers down in significant ways?
The good national model is actually Rhode Island. A lot of states talk really highly about the program what they're doing there, which is basically like just a lot of data. It's on a daily basis where it's data about school attendance is being reported publicly. And I think that allows schools and also, community organizations and families to react in real time. Something that we've heard a lot about, talking to people school leaders, teachers and people in schools, but also people, in outside organizations that work with kids. The frustration is that we don't really know what's going on a day-to-day basis. The city puts out an attendance report every November, and that's kind of like that's all we know about truancy for the entire year. Recently, they started doing these mid-year reports, so maybe we'll get 3 reports a year, but still, like that doesn't really give folks a chance to react in real time. So that is something, I think there's a lot of power in data and just like knowing what's actually happening, and that gives people a chance to react as the problem is happening, not, after the school year has long finished.
As a former turnstile jumper in New York City when I was a kid, I could think about why I jumped turnstiles, right? A part of it was I knew I wasn't paying. Like I had a bus pass, so the city wasn't getting my money anyway. And I also knew I could. And I think a part of what you'd see to extend the metaphor is that, one, they don't feel there's a true cost to missing school because there's not a lot of incentives to school. But I also think another way of thinking about it is to not only look at places around the country, but to look at places in DC that have been effective in the district at lowering truancy, right? What the reporting shows is that when there were school-wide efforts to have pizza parties and caring parents and social workers, right? You saw those numbers go down, right? And you saw crime go down. And it's not that people miss school and then go out marauding, during the daytime when they should be learning, right? It's an indicator that there's something amiss in the student's lifestyle, whether at home, whether it's somewhere else, right? And so the district doesn't need to go very far to find the solution for this. There are schools that are doing it, right? And those are models that, if there was political will and financial resources, could be replicated.
Your guys' reporting was I thought, like a just astonishing, outrageous bombshell of a story. We've obviously described some of the fallout with legislation in the council and so on. And it's hard to assess this, but I'm curious about how much your reporting moved the needle, and whether this is a thing that has risen to the level where next year, when there is a mayoral election and a city council election, people are going to be thinking about this issue as they decide who they're going to vote for. And I think every reporter would say yes, hell yes to that, or wants to. But what should we look for to as we sort of try to determine whether the needle has moved on this?
I think, like I said, what the chancellor has said about adding more middle school programs, that was a huge focus of our story. About what Zach Parker is trying to do, that was a huge focus of our story. I think maybe now we're starting to see the legs. The story came out in June, the school year was wrapping up. Now we're in a new school year and it's more top of mind. So, that's definitely something that we're continuing to track. Right now, there is a hearing about the school-based behavioral health program going on and some proposed changes to that. And that has a huge relationship with truancy. And so, this issue isn't going away. And as long as, people are talking about it and people care about it, then we'll definitely be following it.
Lauren, Robert, thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you. This was great.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. If you liked this episode, consider supporting our work by going to membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.